back to another episode of Revealing Biblical Truths. We are continuing in the series on biblical archaeology. In this video, I will be going over the evidence for the Hittite Empire. But before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below if you want to see other archaeological sites. So, who were the Hittites? Some 3,000 years ago, the Hittites were the most powerful nation in the Middle East. Their empire extended from the Black Sea to Damascus, and more than 620 miles east to west across Anatolia, now a part of modern Turkey. Militarily, they were a foe to be feared. They were masters of strategy and possessed a large number of chariots. Politically, they were more astute than any of their neighbors. They possessed a very humane code of laws, and their women were remarkably emancipated for the times. Yet this great nation not only disappeared from history, it was lost and forgotten so completely that the historians of the 19th century even denied its existence. The 1861 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, under the subject Hittites, contains just 8.5 lines, and even then it's just a summary of what's found in the Bible. The children of Heth formed one of the tribes of the Canaanites, which occupied Palestine before the Israelites. They lived in the mountains of Judea around Hebron, and retained their nationality even after the return of the Israelites from exile. The kings of the Hittites are often mentioned in connection with the kings of Syria, and in the days of Joram their alliance with the Egyptians was the object of dread by the besieged inhabitants of Samaria. In this picture, we see the 3,000-year-old Sphinx of Hattusa, one of two unearthed in 1907 outside the modern town of Bogatkale. The Sphinx was discovered by German archaeologists and has been on display in the Berlin Pergamon Museum since 1934. In 2011, after more than 70 years of wrangling over the valuable sculpture, it was returned to Turkey, following threats to revoke the German Archaeological Institute's permit to excavate in Turkey if it was not returned. The Bible contains many references to this people, with the word Hittite appearing some 46 times in the KJV. We read about them in Genesis 23, 3 and 4, after the death of Abraham's wife Sarah, where Abraham went to the Hittites to buy a parcel of land, later called the Cave of Machpelah. And later, when Israel was about to occupy Canaan, the so-called Promised Land, after fleeing Egypt, the nations who were there mentioned as the Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. But an even more significant occurrence is in 2 Kings 7:6. At that time, Samaria was under siege by the Syrians, when suddenly the Syrians withdrew and retreated. For Yah had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots, and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army. So they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired us against the king of the Hittites, and the king of the Egyptians to attack us." So according to the biblical record, the Hittites were a well-recognized and important and powerful nation. Yet because no ancient historian mentioned them, and because they appear to have no archaeological footprint, critics of the Bible relegated them to the realm of myth, but this was about to change. These are the Hamath stones. Moved to the Istanbul Museum by Dr. White in 1872 amidst outrage from the superstitious local community, these stones became the very first artifacts that attracted modern-day researchers to the existence of a Hittite civilization and language. Some scholars believe that these inscriptions form a connecting link between picture writing and alphabetic writing. The translation of these blocks are building inscriptions of the kings of Hamath, Ur-Helena, and his son, Ur-Atamis. It was in 1812 that the Swiss explorer John Burckhardt discovered the lost city of Petra, returning to Europe with an astonishing tale of the wonders of this red city. In the course of his travels, Burckhardt visited Hamath in northern Syria, where he noticed the foundations of a building, some large oblong stones, which were inscribed with some strange hieroglyphics. They weren't Egyptian, and Burckhardt had no idea of their origin, nor did anybody else. In 1822, Burckhardt published the book Travels in Syria and the Holy Land. In it, he described a stone with a small number of figures and signs that appeared to have hieroglyphic writing, although this does not resemble that of Egypt. Then in 1834, the French explorer Charles Texier was traveling through central Turkey in search of the lost Roman city of Tavium. During his search, he came to the village of Bogaskoy, modern Bogaskale, and he inquired about the ancient ruins and was informed of some nearby things. Here, were sculptured stones, obviously deserted streets and a surrounding wall 5 kilometers in circumference. It was not Tavium. It was too big for that. But what was it? Who had built this occupied and great city? There was no nation of antiquity that fitted it. He went away baffled. A friendly Turk then led Texir across a valley to a clump of larger rocks jutting from the ground. The place was known as Yakilka. Here, engraved on the side of one of the rocks, was a line of figures with peaked hats. Who were they? Texir was mystified. The following year, a British traveler, William Hamilton, came to Bogascale and saw the Texir had seen, and he stumbled across another deserted city known to the Turks as Alakhoyok. Hamilton was equally perplexed by this discovery. In 1862, a Frenchman, George Perrault, came to Bogascale. Besides the things that his predecessors had seen, he found among the ruins a rock face known locally as the Nishan Tash, on which there was a lengthy hieroglyphic inscription. He had no way of knowing what was written on the rock, and he too was bewildered by the strange writing. In 1870, two Americans, Johnson and Jessup, strolling through the bazaar at Hamath, noticed not only the stones that they had reported, but 3 others. And shortly after, a similar stone was discovered 200 kilometers north in Aleppo. The trail was getting hot. Here is Buyokale, meaning great fortress. It was the site of the Hittite Acropolis and state archives on the east side of Bogascale. These archives had played a most important role in learning about the Hittite history, with hundreds of tablets, only contracts and official documents and prophecies, instruction in cult practices, folklore, collections of decisions, and historical texts being discovered. Finally, in 1872, a man of a different character entered. William Wright, an Irish missionary, spoke to the local language, understood the people, and was on good terms with the governor, Zubi Pasha. The governor was an enlightened man, and Wright was able to convince him that the stone should be removed and sent to the museum at Constantinople for safekeeping. But that's where the trouble began. It appears that the local people had a superstitious belief in the stone's curative healing properties for eye diseases. When the governor men began to chisel the stones from the building, the people protested, but the governor, having the military on his side, was able to complete the task and remove the stones to the palace. Then the problems really started. That night, whirling dervishes raced through the streets, stirring up emotions to the frenzied crowd. To make matters worse, there was a shower of falling stars, which heightened the superstitions of the crowd, and they stormed the gates of the palace. Had it not been protection from the soldiers, Wright and the governor would have not lived to see the sunrise. In the morning, the crowd was still there, and the governor admitted the delegation to present their complaints. He listened to their objections, especially to the assertion that Allah had shown displeasure in the displaying of falling stars. He settled the mob, and the stones were removed to the Istanbul Museum, where they still are on display. Wright was able to take impressions of the writing and send it to the British Museum. In 1876, excavations commenced in the site of Karmakish, 100 kilometers northeast of Aleppo, near the border between Turkey and Syria. Numerous impressive monuments of the same style as those in Turkey and stones are inscribed with the same mysterious hieroglyphics discovered there. Indecipherable inscriptions were found as far away as Smyrna on the west coast of Turkey. One thing was apparent. Some great and cultured nation had once occupied this area, and scholars needed to identify it. Finally, in 1880, the archaeological mystery burst. At a meeting of the Society for Biblical Archaeology in London, a young but well-known Orientalist scholar, Archibald Henry Sayce, announced his conviction, despite the critics, that the monuments were to be attributed to the Hittites. Sayce was unmoved by the backlash that followed. He carried out considerable research on the subject and had done some on-the-spot inspections in Turkey. The debate was not only rife among scholars, but in the press, among the British public too, whose imagination had always been easily fired by discoveries. The next year, the new edition of the Britannica was published, and this time, under the heading Hittites, were not 8.5 lines, but 2 pages. The article concluded, "We wait longingly for a confirmation of Professor Sayce's view that the Hittites were the authors of the Hamathite hieroglyphics. If this is proved, this wonderful nation steps into a position hardly surpassed by that of any nations in the distant east. Those were almost prophetic words. Finally, in 1884, Wright published a book, The Empire of the Hittites, in which he presented a mass of scholarly evidence that defied resistance. The Hittites had not only been positively identified, but had taken their place as one of the great nations of antiquity. But the search for truth had really only begun. To be sure, the Hittites had been identified, but nothing was known about their history. That could not be clarified until the Hittite language and writing was understood. The breakthrough didn't come in Turkey or Syria, but in 2,000 kilometers away in Egypt. In 1887, the Tel Amarna letters were discovered. These were clay tablets on which the messages of Assyrian cuneiform was addressed to the pharaoh Akhenaten of Egypt. One of the letters was from a Hittite king, Suppilulimus, to Akhenaten, congratulating on him on his ascension to the throne. This was important, for it not only gave the name of a Hittite king, but provided a synchronism by which it could be dated. For the first time, a date could be affixed to a Hittite king. Two of the Tel Amarna letters were of special importance, known as the Arzawa letters. They were written in readable cuneiform, but included a hitherto unknown language in parallel. Scholars surmised that this might be the Hittite language, and work went into it. In 1902, a Norwegian scholar, Knudsen, announced his opinion that the Hittite language was of Indo-European origin. This suggestion was greeted with derision. Semitic, yes. Hamitic, possibly. But Indo-European, no. Such was the pushback against him that he recanted his assertion, but later it would prove him correct. Another significant development occurred in 1906. Hugo Winkler was a German with an unfortunate personality. He was the type of person that made an instant enemy of anybody he met. He was unfit for work of archaeology and was ill at ease with a foreign culture. In fact, he was not an archaeologist at all. He was a philologist, a scholar in writing. In his field, he was brilliant. He could read the Assyrian cuneiform like we were reading the newspaper. Winkler discovered Boca scale and immediately began digging. He was naturally interested in the inscriptions more than the monuments, and he found them. Some 10,000 clay tablets. Many were written not only in cuneiform, also known as the Babylonian language. He also feverishly went about translating them. Naturally, many of the tablets were in both cuneiform and Hittite. With this added material, scholars made great progress in understanding the Hittite language. In 1915, Friedrich Hosny, a Czech linguist, caused a sensation by announcing that Hittite was indeed an Indo-European language, producing a volume of evidence that the scholars could not argue against. Now, the Hittites, of Hamitic ethnic origin and coming from Palestine, spoke a European type of language. There was much speculation about it, but by 1929 it was understood enough that the Manual of the Hittite Language was published. Here is the Tarkim Domos seal. Hittite hieroglyphs surround a figure in a royal dress, with an inscription repeated in cuneiform around the rim. The text identifies Tarkumoa as the owner and Hittite ruler. The famous bilingual inscription provided the first clues for deciphering the Hittite Luwian hieroglyphs. So the Hittites had been identified, and the Hittite language identified too. There remained only one more problem: deciphering the hieroglyphs. No one imagining it was going to be easy. Archibald Sayce, the scholar who first announced the monuments in Turkey, faced the problem many years earlier. One day he reported that he mentioned a seal had been found in western Turkey and sent to the museum. This seal was reported to include cuneiform writing and unknown figures. Sayce believed it was a bilingual document, something that a philologist must have to have cracked the code. He went into the search of the seal. At the museum, Sayce was told that while the seal was offered to the museum, it had been rejected because of the strange figures that on it. Sayce was flabbergasted, but fortunately the officer recalled a copy of the seal that had been made before it left the museum. The copy became known as the Tarkim Domos seal and was produced, and Sayce went to work. He made some progress being able to work out the word for king and the name of the king, but could not go beyond that. In 1934, Kurt Vattel was excavating in Boca when he discovered no less than 100 bilingual documents. The world was delighted, and it seemed that cracking the Hittite hieroglyphs was only a matter of time. But their hopes were dashed. Some progress was made, but the documents were only on seals, too brief to provide the key. Here we see the Karatep bilingual inscription. When scholars excavated Karatep in 1947, they discovered the first known bilingual inscription in the hieroglyphic and Phoenician. The inscription was carved over 2 stone gates stretching over many elements, ranging from plain to ornamental blocks, covering a figure of a lion and sphinx in relief sculptures. It was not until 1947 that the long-sought key was found. When Bossert, a German philologist, and archaeologist, accepted the invitation to go to Karatep, a remote ruin in southern Turkey, he achieved dramatic success discovering some of the Hittite reliefs. Near the end of the dig, he unearthed the top of a slab of a stone on which some of the Phoenician writing was found. He did more probing and uncovered another stone nearby on which he identified some distinct Hittite hieroglyphics. It seemed he had discovered an all-important bilingual document, but there was no time to pursue the matter further, as he saw no point in raising expectations of his companions. He quickly buried his finds and said nothing to his associates, but 5 months later he was back there. He was a likable character who seemed to possess the sense of the dramatic. He set his party to work at the site, where he previously had reburied the stones, and stood back to watch. He didn't have to wait long. His party soon unearthed the stone. Delighted with their find, he put them to work a few meters away where he knew they would find the Hittite inscription. In a few moments, they found that also, but it emerged from a dusty bed in the fading light of that late afternoon. Bossert realized what he had thought to be Hittite hieroglyphics were nothing more than cracks in the stone caused by time. His heart sank. But the party continued digging, and to his delight, not far away they found the stone. Although there were some characters who had not completely understood, most of the Hittite hieroglyphics can be read, and scholars have been able to put together the history of this once great empire. Their hieroglyphics were originally credited as Hittite because they were found in the cities of Hattusa, but it is now recognized that Hittites actually adopted the Luwian script. The Luwians were related to Hittites and were dominant in the late Hittite culture. According to biblical records, the Hittites were strongly represented in Palestine, but either migrated or were forced out of Anatolia. Apparently, the migratory wave swept down from the north and conquered the Hittites, imposing their Indo-European language and culture upon them while adopting the Hittite name. This first king of the new people was Anitas, who conquered Hattusa, now called Bocaskale, and pronounced the curse upon it. The curse did not work very well because it was soon rebuilt and became the capital city of the Hittite Empire. The king who took the Hittites and consolidated them into a nation was Labarnas. He became a legendary figure, and later kings took his name as a title, much like Egyptian kings were known as pharaohs. Later, Mucilius I led his armies in foreign conquests, marching them as far as Babylon, which they plundered, making off with a golden image of the god Marduk. But it was Suppilulimus who took the Hittites to the pinnacle of their power. He rebuilt Hattusa, and he was responsible for the inscription on the rock face known as the Nishan Tash. It was actually a king list, and he, of course, was the last king listed, perhaps to establish his right to rule. He developed his army in a formidable military machine, with a strong chariot force. He established the rule over all of what we call Turkey now, and northern Syria. It was he who sent a message of congratulations to Akhenaten on his ascension to the Egyptian throne. While he was campaigning in Syria, a dramatic incident occurred. An Egyptian delegation arrived at his camp with a message from Akhenaten, or Akhensumenen, the widowed queen of Tutankhamun. The message reads, "My husband died, and not one son do I have, but of you it is said I have many sons. You have many sons. If you will give me a son of yours, he could be my husband, for how could I take one of my slaves and make him a husband and honor him?" This is very reminiscent of Moses and the Red Sea. He felt the request was too good to be true, so he dispatched a delegation of his own to see if the offer was genuine. The delegation confirmed the offer, and he was brought back a plea from the Egyptian queen, for a Hittite prince to be sent to Egypt. He didn't hesitate, and he sent one of his sons, but his delay proved fatal, as then the statesman's priest Ai had seized the throne and the young queen. Before the Hittite prince arrived, he was assassinated. It's intriguing to speculate how the course of history might have changed had he acted promptly. Egypt might have become a province of the Hittite Empire, with the Hittites seated upon the throne. A confrontation between the two great superpowers of then the known world was inevitable, and it came in the days of Mutawalli II. His opponent was Ramses the Great of Egypt. The clash was well known in the Battle of Kadesh, in which Ramses was fortunate to escape with his life. A few years later, Ramses was content to sign a non-aggression pact with his successor, Attulus III. But the sun was about to set on the Hittite Empire. Attulus IV was the last great Hittite king. He was a reformer and responsible for the rock carvings at Yazilkaya. A small stone temple was built at the entrance to the natural rocks. Foundations of this temple has been excavated by archaeologists and can be seen by visitors to this day. There is also a well-preserved relief of him in the embrace of his god. The Hittite Empire was polytheistic, and the line of figures copied on the rock face depicts some of their gods. But the so-called people of the sea were on the march, and they swept over the Hittite region, obliterating it from history. A few pockets of resistance remained, but they too soon disappeared, and the Hittites were lost and forgotten. Only in the Bible was there preserved a knowledge of this great nation, again underscoring the veracity, at the very least, of an accurate history of humankind, and a useful tool of archaeology, and not something to be offered to scoffed at. Thanks for watching. Till next time, shalom.